Chairman. This underlying provision would allow people to self-certify their identity and earnings in order to receive these paid leave benefits. You heard that right? Self-certify. The word self-attestation appears no less than 5 times in the description of the application for this program. Self-attestation in any program is ripe for fraud. Only the very naive would think that it is not. Just look at the damage that has been done over the last year and a half to our unemployment system. Congress created new pandemic unemployment programs that also allowed self-certification. I know Democrats don't always like to talk about it, but organized crime and fraudsters took full advantage of a lax program and the requirements in that program because of this glaring loophole. I brought this up before in this committee and assured we would address it, and we have not. In fact, the Labor Department's Inspector General issued a report in October 2020 detailing the fraud. Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to submit this report for the record.
So ordered.
That policy has resulted in anywhere from 89 to 400 billion in estimated fraud. We don't know the true number because House Democrats have not held one single oversight hearing, despite repeated warnings by both GAO and the Labor Department's Inspector General, pointing to self-certification as one of the main weaknesses allowing criminals to defraud the program through identity theft. I've had many constituents reach out to me with unemployment fraud concerns. One who called me crying because someone filed a claim in his wife's name who had passed away. That's why I'm offering this amendment today, in order to avoid replicating one of the largest fraudulent disbursements of taxpayer dollars in our nation's history. My amendment would strike the language that allows for self-certification and require documentation of identity, earnings, and employment prior to authorizing family leave and or medical leave benefits. As an employer and an employee for many years, these are easy to acquire. I'm shocked that Democrats have not learned from the past mistakes. Let's correct that today. Are any of my colleagues really going to vote against this amendment to require that we at least confirm the identity of the applicants? Or does one consider it a needed benefit for criminals? We need to ensure that this brand new entitlement program is not designed to allow fraudulent claims to be processed. That is not fair to the American taxpayer. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, I would like to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquarello, on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My good friend who is putting forth this amendment, I think with a lot of other people, need to understand that if this amendment in itself, it sounds reasonable. But I'd like to see the numbers. And I've looked at the states that have stopped and cut off their own unemployment. They've stopped it earlier than the federal government's money running out. I'm not so sure that this is the major mover, as you would assume, of why people aren't going back to work. Because a lot of the folks still didn't go back to work after the benefits have been cut off in certain states. So what I'm saying to you is, you and I need the numbers to indicate if this is the main mover. You know, I think that it's possible. I don't know if you maybe you don't put too much weight into it. People like staying home. And that may seem frivolous and minimal, but that could be the reason. And we need to address it. We have not seen yet the total effects emotionally on our population about being out of work because of this pandemic. We have not. And we've only recently started to talk about in legislation that we passed money that would go to help those people who are suffering from being out of work, away from their associates. So I'm not so sure of the basic reasons, and we shouldn't assume it. I don't think Americans are basically lazy at all. People want to work. And you're not, I know you're not saying that they're basically lazy, but you're saying that because they were getting a check, they didn't want to have to go back to work because they were getting as much money. No, I listened. And I would ask you to just think twice about what you're offering, because I think it makes too many assumptions.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
This amendment has nothing to do at all with what you just discussed. I'd just like to say that to my friend. This is about fraud. This is about fraud and abuse of a government program by criminals. That's what this amendment is about. It has nothing to do with people going back to work, et cetera.
Reclaiming my time.
And you said something about the numbers, and I said in my statement, we don't know the true number of how much was lost by fraud, but we have the IG's report, and we don't know the numbers because we haven't had one oversight hearing, despite repeated warnings by both GAO and the Labor Department's Inspector General, pointing that self-certification was one of the main weaknesses allowing criminals to defraud.
Reclaiming my time.
Through identity theft, yes.
Doc, I reclaim my time for this reason. You're using the word fraud, which is that's pretty serious, what you're saying. And I think it's worth looking into. There's no question about it. But to sit there and say, you know, it's almost like saying there's fraud in elections. It's a good thing, you know, we assume these things. And how many, and people who fraudulently collect this money should be prosecuted. So we agree on the end, but we can't make those assumptions before we start to examine people's livelihood. That's because that's what you're going to get into. It's like following people because we think they're from a country, therefore we need intel on the individual. We're assuming these people are not dealing honestly with the government. We're assuming it. You don't say that, but you're assuming it. Thank you. I yield.
From California, continue to insist on his point of order.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized, Mr. Brady, to speak on the amendment. They will proceed in order of request to Mr. Gomez, Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think we can be in denial any longer about how many billions of fraud that occurred in the COVID pandemic unemployment program. Our own government estimates that it could be as high as 89 billion. Outside sources who verify these figures say it could be as much as 400 billion, which is more than we spend on the Army and the Navy combined each year. Republicans offered an amendment in this committee. Every Democrat voted against. It was pretty simple. It said before states pay out these unemployment benefits, pandemic benefits, that the state verify the identity of the person, what their wages for, and who they work for. Pretty simple. All of you turned that down, and we heard the same arguments we just heard a minute ago. You're assuming people are trying to be fraudulent. You know, you're casting aspersions on them. We heard all that. Nothing happened. And that open-ended fraud, the greatest theft of American tax dollars in history, continued until Labor Day. I think what Dr. Wenstrup is trying to do is this is a huge new entitlement program, will cost, hundreds of billions of dollars. So repeating the same mistake again doesn't make sense. What he's saying that rather than allowing the same self-certification we saw that allowed so much fraud there, let's not do that again. And why don't we require the same type of documentation we already do in the Family Medical Leave Act, the same documentation we do with our own workers here in Congress when they're seeking that family medical leave. The reason Mr. Pascal, my friend, I think this is important, is that unlike the FMLA, this discussion will no longer be between the employee and their work. This will be between the employee and Treasury, who will have very little opportunity, just like in the pandemic unemployment, to actually verify this. So what Dr. Wenstrup is trying to do is close that huge door for fraud before it occurs. And it may not be the workers. It could be like with the pandemic, foreign actors, organized crime rings, fraudsters stealing these identities. I think it's a very reasonable amendment that, frankly, if we want to keep precious tax dollars going to paid medical family leave, let's close that door now. That's why I would urge us to come together to support Dr. Wenstrup's amendment. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Gomez, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I oppose this amendment because it assumes that there's going to be this wide set fraud. But I don't really think that there's going to be all these people claiming that they just had a child in order to bond with it to get 12 weeks of leave so that they can go home and take care of it. I don't see that there's going to be this kind of these overwhelming people pretending to be pregnant when they're not. And that is something that is borne out in California, that kind of fraud doesn't exist because we have taken precautions there in California, but we also have precautions here in this bill. Our bill includes multiple provisions to ensure the integrity of this new program to combat fraud. It requires legacy states and employers who receive grants to share information with Treasury about people receiving benefit so Treasury doesn't pay for more than 12 weeks of benefits. It requires the Secretary of the Treasury to authenticate the identity of applicants and the credentials of medical professionals who are certifying the need for caregiving that causes a worker to take leave. It imposes severe penalties for anyone who makes false statements in an application, including fines and imprisonment up to 5 years or both. It bars workers from receiving benefits for 5 years if they make false statements to secure benefits. It bars anyone who has engaged in fraud, including doctors or lawyers, from submitting evidence in support of a benefit claim. It requires the Secretary of the Treasury to promptly redetermine eligibility if there's any reason to believe that fraud or similar fault was involved in an application for benefits and collective benefit. And it imposes penalties on employers who have received federal reimbursement for their paid leave programs but have failed to deliver the benefits to their employees as promised. So this has the provisions to protect against fraud, but it is extremely difficult to pretend or to be fraudulent about having a child. So this is something that is, I don't believe is necessary. I believe that the fraud concern is overstated. But at the same time, I wish my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will have the same passion when it comes to holding accountable people who are cheating on their taxes, who are not, from the highest corporations to the highest workers, to funding that. But I guess we all make choices. They choose to try to focus on working class people who are not likely to fraud the federal government and ignore the tax cheats that get away with robbing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars for the American taxpayer. Will the gentleman yield? Yes, I will.
I share some of the concerns that Dr. Wenstrup has raised with his amendment, and I trust if there are ways to strengthen the provisions we already have in the bill, multiple ones that are there that don't give an absolute veto to an employer who doesn't want his employee to take medical leave when there's good reason to do so, that you and our chairman would be open to looking at ways to improve and strengthen the anti-fraud provisions, because the last thing we want is to see this very worthy provision abused or misused.
Does the gentleman yield back his time? The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Dr. Wenstrup.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate the conversation. Yeah, one thing, Mr. Gomez, the states can't verify. The states can't verify accurately if the person applying isn't verifying accurately and completely. So I find that to be a little bit of a dichotomy there. I don't assume anything as far as this fraud goes and what's happened in the unemployment realm, because many of you should have and probably did have people calling your office telling you that they got a form from the IRS that said they received benefits when they never did. And as I said in my statement, one got a notice saying that they received benefits when their spouse had passed away. It's not assumed. These are American citizens that are reporting this. Therefore, the Inspector General has done a whole report and tried to tally a number. And as the ranking member had said, much of this fraud is being performed by people outside of the United States. And the money is going to their accounts. And so you can have all these restrictions in and all these things that says, oh, you're going to be held accountable. They don't even live here. How are you going to hold them accountable? This is a simple process.
Dr. Wenstrup, this is Kevin Brady. Would the gentleman yield for 30 seconds?
Please, yes.
I know that's not your time, but I'll be very brief. One, you know, I know there's good intentions here, but to be clear, California leads the country in the worst unemployment fraud in the pandemic numbers. We've heard these arguments before. There's no problem. Why do we address it? And I do, but we need to. And I do appreciate Mr. Doggett's point. The one thing I would point out, under this bill, the conversations are no longer between the worker and their employer. This is all the conversation between them and Treasury. So there is not the reasonable discussion that has worked so well under FMLA, where you have reasonable documentation. It has worked very well. I don't know why we wouldn't continue that proven approach here, as especially as we already know what's happened with self-attestation on unemployment fraud. It seems there should be a reasonable way to extend the FMLA reasonable documentation to prevent this fraud. And Dr. Wenstrup and the original author, I yield back to whomever has this time.
Would whoever has the time yield?
Dr. Wenstrup has the time.
Yes.
Doctor, would you yield?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. I'm sympathetic to what the amendment's author is trying to do. I want to point out that Mr. Brady's correct. California did have a pretty major fraud hit in regard to unemployment, but it was identity fraud. And I'm told that that is covered in this bill, and that's protected. But I'm against anybody cheating on any of this stuff, either recipients of a program such as this, or taxpayers who cheat on their taxes, or contractors who cheat the government on their contracts, and would like to see stronger language in all of those areas. But I'm told that your language is somewhat duplicative, but I'm willing to work with you on this. And if there's a way to make it tighter going forward, I'm all for that and would encourage you to work with me to do that. I yield back.
Well, in the time remaining that I have that was yielded to me by Mr. Kelly, now is the time. Now is the time. This is a simple amendment to simply identify who you are, where you worked, and that's really about it. And I don't think it would take a lot of conversation. This is a very simple amendment, and I encourage everyone to vote for it on behalf of the American taxpayers, which that's who's getting ripped off. That's who's getting ripped off. Now yield back.
Does the gentleman from, thank you, gentlemen, does the gentleman from Oregon wish to be recognized on the amendment? Mr. Blumenauer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the intent of the author of this amendment. I appreciate the comments from Mr. Thompson and Mr. Doggett. Interested in being able to deal with questions of fraud. And I think we're all overwhelmed by what's happening with foreign actors, hackers. It's not just the government. It happens with the private sector. This is something that concerns, I think, us all. And I appreciate some of the conciliatory comments and a show of good faith that this is something we all need to contend with, because there are billions of dollars that are being siphoned out of government and private sector accounts. And our tools are lacking. But I also appreciate a couple of my colleagues making the reference to an area of fraud or criminal activity that we know is there. $400 billion. That tax gap is not theoretical. It's real money that is not being declared. People aren't paying taxes. Now, part of the concern that we're facing is that the IRS has been systematically hollowed out. Now, recently, we've given them lots of challenges, some of which they handled better than others, but they were our front line of defense to be able to get critically needed money out to keep the economy and families afloat. Now, I am hopeful that the interest in integrity of the process carries over, as we're going to have some conversations coming up in the next few days about being able to equip the IRS to be able to be equal to the challenge of tax compliance. I mean, these are criminal activities, and there are some that are, people wink at, where we rely on voluntary compliance for our tax system. But we have systematically undercut the ability of the IRS to deal with voluntary compliance. What's happened with audits? I mean, I have tax professionals, attorneys, financial advisors that tell me the audit function is now a joke. It's not just that taxpayers can't get answers on helplines because the IRS has been hollowed out. We're not investing in high value activity that would enforce compliance and would provide more money. So I hope this spirit of integrity of the process carries over as we talk about much bigger dollars that are being lost every day because of this systematic assault on the IRS. And I hope that we're going to be able to work together to do something about it.
Would the gentleman yield to?
I
Thanks.
would.
I think the gentleman's absolutely correct. It's inconsistent to use the example of suggesting that the IRS staff members are not answering the phone and then understand that their budget's been cut by more than 25% over these last few years. And tax compliance in America through withholding has a 93 or 94% success ratio. So it's not the individual who goes to work every day that's the one that we should be viewing. It's the sophisticated tax avoidance that we should be viewing. So I thank the gentleman for his comments. And let me recognize Mr. Rice, and then I think we're prepared to move on. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm reading from an article from NBC News from 2 weeks ago, and it's about the unemployment fraud. Russian mobsters, Chinese hackers, and Nigerian scammers have used stolen identities to plunder tens of billions of dollars in COVID unemployment benefits, spiriting the money overseas in a massive transfer of wealth from the United States taxpayers, officials, and experts say, and it's still happening. Among the ripest targets has been jobless programs. The federal government cannot say for sure how much of the $900 billion in pandemic-related unemployment has been stolen. Credible estimates range from $87 billion to $400 billion, at least half of which went to foreign criminals, law enforcement say. These staggering sums dwarf, even on the low end, what the federal government spends every year on intelligence collection, food stamps, or K-12 education. This is perhaps the single biggest organized fraud heist we've ever seen, said security researcher Armin Nigerian of the firm RSA. Jeremy Sheridan, who directs the Office of Investigations at the Secret Service, called it the largest fraud scheme I've ever encountered. State attorneys general, who we've met with several times, that was the end of the quote. State attorneys general, who we've met with several times here, with the Ways and Means Committee and with the Human Resources Subcommittee, tell us as much as 30% of the earned income tax credit paid out is fraudulent. All this amendment does is remove the self-attestation. If you allow people to self-attest, foreign criminals will take advantage. And they don't care one whit about the enforcement provisions in this bill. Once they get the money, they are gone. And up to half of this unemployment fraud went to Russians and Nigerians and other folks around, Chinese criminals around the world. All we're saying here is get the employer to certify and validate the identity. And that will eliminate most of the fraud. It is a simple step to keep the American taxpayer from being fleeced. I support the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair is prepared to call the question. Questions on agreeing to the amendment offered by Dr. Wenstrup of Ohio. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request the yeas and nays, please.
Dr. Wenstrup has requested the yeas and nays, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson?
No.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer?
Votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell?
Pascal votes no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene?
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer?
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans?
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider?
Snyder votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi?
No.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford?
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett?
Plaskett votes nay.
Ms. Plaskett votes nay. Mr. Brady?
Mr. Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith of Nebraska votes
Horsford
aye.
votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Plaskett
Mr.
votes
Reed?
nay.
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert?
Schweikert, yes.
Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood? Dr. Wenstrup?
Yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington?
Yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson?
Yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes?
Yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker?
Aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn?
Aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller? Aye. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Kind?
Kind votes no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. LaHood?
Mr. LaHood is yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman votes no.
I see her, she decided.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
We're not finished with calling this one yet, but we appreciate your enthusiasm.
I'm excited, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 nays and 17 yays.
There being 25 nays and 17 ayes, the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Smith, you are not recorded. Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Chairman, we have an updated tally of 25 nays and 18 ayes. And 18 ayes.
Thank the clerk for that update. 25 to 18, the amendment fails.